Hi class, in this video I want to talk about the long tail of PR. The long tail is a concept you read about this week. I want to explain a little bit further how it's going to guide your work in this class, but in order to do that we actually need to back up and talk about the internet and talk about how the internet has changed marketing and public relations. So the internet really did change everything, in terms of reaching audiences. Before the internet, we had mass media models. Mass media are media that have a huge reach, but are controlled by very few. So you have the New York Times, you've got your the paper in town, you've got radio stations. These are all media for which a few people decide the content and create the content, and then they release it in these mass channels. TV, for example. You have makers who are making the content, deciding what the content should be, what's important, figuring out what information is important, and then sending it out to millions of mass people in a mass audience very easily. And these models worked for a long time. But the internet doesn't work that way. The internet uses a social media model. So the internet uses a model where people can create, people can be the media. You no longer have to go get a job at your town paper if you want to write a movie review that people in your town can read. You can do that online. So the internet really did change everything as far as communication is concerned. It's an excellent tool for communication, but we use it differently than the old mass media model. You don't really have the mass media model online like you did with the newspapers and the radio stations and the television stations. And a good example of just how these mass media of yesteryear were so powerful is radios. When the radio was first invented, they were sold at stores, places like Sears that carried lots of different goods. And they wanted to sell radios, but the problem was, what was going to be broadcast on the radio? In order to set up a radio station, you needed a lot of money. You had to buy equipment, you had to buy microphones, you had to buy broadcast equipment to broadcast on a frequency. You couldn't just set up a radio station, just randomly decide, hey, I'm going to do that. You needed some money behind it. You needed a lot of money up front to build a studio, and then you had to figure out what your content was going to be. You picked it, you wrote the scripts, you managed all that, and then you broadcast it. So when radios first came out, the average person couldn't make their own radio station. So who was going to? Well, newspapers started broadcasting. Even places, stores that were selling radios would actually buy broadcast equipment and broadcast shows. So you could buy a radio at a store, and the store would say, hey, we have a station tuned to this frequency and you can hear our programming, because they could afford to. In order to be a creator in mass media, you needed money, you needed resources. You couldn't just wake up one morning and start a radio station. You couldn't just wake up one morning and start a newspaper. You needed investment. And so you had smaller groups of people who were even able to get into these markets to produce content doing it. Most people, they couldn't communicate out on mass media. They could only listen in. They could only receive the mass media. They could only read the paper or listen to the broadcast. They couldn't go out and make their own paper, write their own articles. They couldn't go out and make their own radio stations and radio broadcasts. With the internet, we have an even playing field. Anyone can get online and create something. So you can have a radio station online. You can have a newspaper online. If you have a computer, you can get on there and do that. So what we see with the internet, with these mass media models, if you're in public relations, what do you have to do to reach the audience? Well, you have to go through the media, because the media control the access to those big audiences. Other people can't just get in there and start using mass media. So as people working in PR, you would have to get the media to write about you, to broadcast something about you in order to reach the public. Now that we have the internet, we have the social media model where anyone can create and share and consume what other people have made. So there's two models now. If you're in PR, you can either try to get the web leaders. So if you are trying to release a message about a clothing company, for example, you can find out who the famous clothing bloggers are, and then they can give your message to the public on their blog, or you can just reach the audience directly. You don't need to go through anyone. You can set up a website. You can set up your own blog. You can put your information online and just give it to the audience. You don't need to go through anybody anymore. So that's how the internet has really changed everything. And so before, you had to use media to reach buyers. Now you're going to be reaching buyers directly online. You're still going to rely on media offline, but online you're going to reach buyers directly. And so one of my goals in this class is not just to teach you design, but to teach you some digital design and get you thinking about how the media is different online and how you really can reach buyers directly. And when you're designing for something online, you're designing for your buyer, you're designing for your audience. You're not designing for a middleman, a newspaper, or a broadcast station. There's one concept that's really important to understanding the modern web that I just want to go over really quickly. It's called Web 2.0. We're currently in an era defined by Web 2.0, and we use 2.0 because you can sort of think about Web 1.0 as being that crummy old internet that you might have had when you were really little that didn't do anything but send email. There were no videos to watch. You couldn't really even look at slideshows because the pictures took too long. You couldn't have your own site. That's old web, Web 1.0. So we draw the distinction between that and what we have now, which is Web 2.0. And there's three main principles of Web 2.0, so I'm going to talk about each one and explain what it has to do with public relations. So the first is tools for authoring and sharing content without having to know about web structures and HTML. So 20 years ago, if you wanted to make a website, you had to learn programming and you had to program your own website, or you had to get some money and pay someone who did, right? Those were your two options. You either had to know it or you had to get money and pay someone who did. Today, you can go to any number of websites and have a website in less than a minute. You can go to WordPress.com and get a website in probably 30 seconds. So you can use that website then to create and share content. You don't have to know programming and you don't need money to pay someone else to program for you. So what this means is that anyone can write for the media now. Anyone can be a content producer online. Offline, it's still harder. We're still in some of those mass media models. We still have a lot of people who control mass media channels. Online, anyone can author and share content, which means anyone online can be part of the media. Storing data on other entities' servers. So this is really technical in nature. This is the idea of the cloud, the idea that when you use services online like WordPress and YouTube, you can upload your data to their computers and they'll hold on to it for you. So why do we care about this in public relations? Well, one interesting offshoot of this idea is the rise in video. If any of you have ever worked with video, and I know many of you have probably had multimedia classes here at Ball State that dealt with video, the files are very large and hard to work with, and they take a lot of space to store. I've had video lectures that were half a gig, which doesn't seem that big, but when you have 20 of them in a semester, if they were all that big, you know, that's 10 gigs of data. That's kind of a lot. So this idea of storing data on other entities' servers, video is a good example. Video is, you know, they have large files. Now, you just give your video to YouTube, they put it on their computer, they store it. It doesn't matter how large the file is because you don't keep it on your computer. It goes to them and they take care of it. So what this means is that anyone can store media. This lowers the cost of creating different kinds of media. It's gonna be easier for your company to make and share video if they don't have to store the videos themselves, if they can put the videos on YouTube and YouTube will store it because storage costs money. Social tools for connecting people, not just documents. So the idea that you have tools online. When you go to a web page, it looks like a document, it looks like a page, but when you go to Twitter or Facebook, it's not that idea at all. It's a social network where you can connect to other people. So with Web 2.0, this is a new era of web where you use the internet to communicate in many different ways. And what this means now is that anyone can talk to anybody online and you can distribute media now. So you no longer have to rely on a press release being picked up by a journalist. You can go online, put the press release on your own site, share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook, get into conversations with your audience without that middleman. So just to review really what the result of Web 2.0 is, that we go from this focus on publishers, people who have the money and the resources to use mass media, to audiences. Anyone online feels in control. They decide what they make and what they look at. Your book has a good example of this. David Meerman Scott talks about interrupting, this idea that Advertising relies on interruption. They interrupt your TV show with a commercial. They interrupt your bus ride with a flashing sign. I was on a flight once, a Frontier flight, and about 20 minutes before we landed, someone came on the intercom and read out loud an advertisement for like a credit card that they have. Well, I mean, I'm like literally trapped in a plane, so they're interrupting my plane ride to try and sell me this credit card that I have no interest in, and now I'm kind of mad because I was, you know, trying to relax and not totally hate being on this airplane, and now someone's talking at me about something I don't care about for like 10 minutes. It's an interruption. You have to interrupt my flight in order to make me listen to your message. And what the internet does is it gets rid of that. Online, you can't make people look at things. You can't interrupt people. You can't sort of try to grab their attention. You've all had the experience where you went to a website and it had a pop-up ad. A lot of you have pop-up blockers. I have not seen a pop-up ad in years because I have a pop-up blocker. I don't know if they still exist. I'm sure they do. Those of you who don't have pop-up blockers, when you see pop-ups, the first thing you do is click the X. You can't interrupt someone's time on the internet. That's not how the web works. When people are online, they're in control. They decide where they go. There's not really a standard way of using the internet. Some people start every day by going to CNN. Some people start by going to Facebook. There's probably people in this classroom who have not done much interneting outside of Facebook or Twitter. And there might be some who've never gone there. So you don't have a typical experience. The audience does what they want. They feel in control when they're online, and you can't interrupt them. You can't make people look at you anymore. You can't interrupt their TV show online. I mean, Hulu tries. You can pay to make it less severe. For the most part, people wander away. There's other ways around those ads. So for the most part online, you can't make people look at you anymore. You have to earn your audience. You have to talk directly to them where they're already going. And this brings me to the concept of the long tail. So the long tail is a theory or concept created by Chris Anderson, former editor of Wired magazine. And he wrote a book with the same name. It's called The Long Tail. And he writes in this book that what he was sort of looking at is models like music. I don't know if any of you ever had Rhapsody. It was a player that you could install on your computer, kind of like iTunes, and you could, it's sort of like a cross between iTunes and Spotify, because you could look up different songs, and if they were on there, you could listen to them. And he was curious about things like that. He was thinking, you know, there's millions of songs on services like Rhapsody. What's happening on those? Do people just all listen to the same popular songs? Or, you know, there's some really obscure artists on there. Are people listening to that? And that got him interested in this concept of, you know, what are we doing online? Is it mass media where everyone's looking at the same things, or is it different? And what he discovered and wrote a sort of theory about is the long tail. And he sort of says, if you look here at the chart, in the left we have a red area that's called the head, and you'll see the curve is very high in popularity. There's a few number of products that are insanely popular that can be considered hits. So music is a great example. This is where your Beyonce is. You know, these are the Beyoncés, the Pharrells, this is the Black Eyed Peas, and I don't know, what are you kids listening to these days? This video is going to be really dated, I'm sure, at some point. But these are your really, you know, these are your Lady Gagas. These are your really, really famous artists that everyone has listened to, everyone knows about. In a previous class, I brought this up and I asked people, what kind of music do you think is in the hit? And every single person I asked, it was like 12 different people, all said Beyonce first. These are a small number of products, in this case musicians or singers, who get a huge, insane number of hits. Almost everybody listens to them. They're insanely popular. But here's the thing, that's just not really the only thing there. If you look at Rhapsody, which Chris Anderson did, what he found is that there are a lot of singers and musicians who are featured, you know, you can listen to on that service, who are not nearly as popular as Beyonce, who most people haven't heard of, but they still have an audience. You could go to even the most obscure singer or musician on Rhapsody, and they were still getting listens. It just continued seemingly forever this long tail where the popularity was lower, but there were a ton of products, there were a ton of musicians that had low-level popularity and only a few musicians who had stellar hit-making popularity. And Chris Anderson theorizes that this applies to a lot of different things. It certainly applies to products, books on Amazon, which is a great example mentioned in your book textbook. On Amazon, there's some bestseller books. You've got the Dan Brown books, you've got the Suzanne Collins, you've got J.K. Rowling. These are insanely popular, but Amazon makes its money on all the unpopular books that it sells just a few copies of. So there's lots of books on there that sell only a couple thousand copies, but there's so many like that Amazon is making money off of that long tail. So you can find the most obscure book on Amazon that looks like a complete dud, and someone has bought it. Someone has bought it and read it. So what does this mean for us as PR professionals? Well, it means that when we're online, because the long tail is a concept that comes from online, before the internet we had mass media. You can sort of think of the head of this as being mass media. The internet allows for these niche products in the long tail. So the internet allows us to have the long tail because of Web 2.0, because people can make their own content and share it and consume other people's homemade content. So online, we as PR professionals can think about information as belonging to the long tail, and we can think about resources online, CNN.com, Huffington Post, our own website, bloggers. We can think about that media that we want to leverage as being some part of this long tail graphic, either in the head or in the long tail. And what Scott suggests to us is that we really need to consider the long tail. If we have a message that we want to get to audiences, we might not be able to get the Huffington Post to reprint our press release or write about our press release or even write any brief or anything about the information we want them to. We might not get in there. We might not be able to get in the head. But the beauty of the internet is we can make our own blog, we can make our own website, and we can put our information there. Now the problem is we'll be in the long tail, which as you can see means we're not going to be as popular. So we're not going to get as much of the audience as we would if we were on Huffington Post. But the beauty of that is that we don't necessarily always want the biggest audience. When you go out into your career, when you graduate from Ball State and you get a job working in PR, what you'll learn very quickly is that you'll have to adapt to a specific field. You're going to be doing PR for a tech company, or PR for a nonprofit that deals with human rights, or PR for an industrial applications company. And you're going to have to learn about what they do. You're going to have to learn about that field. But the beauty of the long tail is you have fewer people looking at your stuff if you're in that long tail. You don't have the popularity, but you can get those people who know about you and your business. So if you're a tech company, do you really care if everyone sees your message? Does a 40-year-old housewife with 4 kids who doesn't even have an iPhone need to see your message? No, that's a waste of time and money. You need the techies. You need people who are interested in the tech industry. And so you want the niche audience. You want the people in the long tail to latch on to you. It's okay if you're not in the head because your message isn't for everybody. And that's one of the biggest lessons I hope you'll learn as you go through this course, is that your message, you're not Oprah. You're not going to be on Oprah. Your message doesn't need to go out to everybody most of the time. It needs to go to only the people who are seriously going to consider your message and care about it when we're working online. So this is the concept of the long tail. It's great because it means we have niche audiences that we can connect with. We can reach our buyers directly, but it's also a little scary because it means, you know, we have so much competition. Look how long the tail is. We have to compete against other online entities trying to publish information that might be more important than ours, that might attract audiences. And it means we really have to earn our audience. The biggest thing I'm going to say in this class over and over again is you have to earn your audience. You can't just expect that someone's going to read your newsletter or your email newsletter or your website. You have to entice people to read it and earn their consideration. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about there's 3 principles that are going to guide your work with PR on the web. And really, they should guide your work in PR in general, whether it's online or offline. Authenticity, information, and engagement. And I'm going to bring these up over and over and over again. In this class, yes, this is a design class, but what I want you to learn is that even when you're working with design, public relations is all about finding the right audience in the right channel. So getting the right information to the right people in the right way with authenticity and in an engaging manner. So authenticity means showing that we are true and credible, that we are trustworthy, that we have a real passion, that we're not putting information out that we don't really care about or we don't think is helpful or we think is sneaky or underhanded. Authenticity. Information, making sure the audience gets the information that they need. It's got to be tied to our messaging in some way. And then engagement. Since we're competing in the long tail, we're in that area where there's lots of competitor products and we all have less audience than the famous people in the head. We really need to be engaging to help earn our audience. We need to give our audiences the information that they need, but in a way that interests them and engages them and gets them to think about us and talk, have a conversation with us so that they'll be really loyal customers. So in this class, you're going to learn how to select and design content for the right audience in the right channel. So yes, you will learn about design principles, but a graded component of every assignment, I'll look at what you've made and I'll ask, is this the right information for the right audience in this channel? So design is not just about pretty colors and balance and making things look nice. Design fulfills a purpose. So everything you're going to design in this class, you want to make sure that it's designed in such a way that it's the right information for the right audience and that what you've designed is the right channel. You don't want to make a blog for people who don't read blogs. You don't want to make a newsletter for people who hate newsletters. So we'll go over this over and over again, but in this class, it's all about authenticity, information, and engagement. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we can do to overcome this problem with the web, where anyone can make, anyone can create, you can't hold people's attention. I'm going to sort of talk about what do we do now. Web 2.0 is real. We don't have mass media online. How do we leverage that to give the best PR messages that we can with the best design?